Welcome to Lengua Franca. This is the second in the three-part series on irregular verbs of the present tense. And in this video, we will focus on the blasted and oft-maligned stem change verbs. It seems that beginning Spanish students have more comments about these verbs than perhaps any other, which is understandable. Just when you think you have a conjugation pattern, something comes in and messes you up. In this case, it seems that these are really common, often used verbs. And they are. So let's talk about them, showcase their patterns, and see how we can let go of the ill will towards these linguistic twisters. To start off, let's review the groups of verbs that we will encounter when we study irregular verbs. If you saw the first video in this series, you remember this breakdown of irregular present tense verbs. The ones that only have an irregular yo form, the stem-changing verbs, and the fully irregular verbs, aka the mildly funky verbs, the funky verbs, and the funky verbs. In part 1, we talked about the verbs with irregular yo forms. In this video, we will cover the stem-changing verbs, which is by far the largest of these three groups. We will come back to the fully irregular verbs in part 3. This term, stem changing, confuses many people as they first learn Spanish. But it is a pretty straightforward concept. To start off, let's describe what a stem is. Take 3 regular verbs in Spanish that we know well by now: hablar, comer, and vivir. To find the stem, we simply take off the infinitive ending, or the ar, and ir ending of the infinitive. That leaves us with the stem of the verb, in this case, habla, come, and vive. When we conjugate any verb, we use the stem as our starting point. For example, the present tense indicative conjugation that we have learned. Now let's move to stem-changing verbs. What does that mean? Well, let's look at 3 stem-changing verbs: dormir, cerrar, and preferir. Can you figure out their stems? Right, they are dorm, ser, and prefer. The difference with these verbs is that the last vowel in the stem will change in some way. So in these verbs, the o of dorm, the e of ser, and the second e of prefer will change in some way. And as we will see in the next slides, they do. That's it. Now for the bad news. As we learn Spanish vocabulary, and in particular new verbs, we have to associate them as being regular or irregular in some way. And that is how we remember whether a verb is a stem changer or not. There really is no trick or easy way to remember them. The good news is that because these verbs are so common, that with practice, you will naturally remember that there is some funkiness with these verbs. It will become second nature soon enough. Time to look at the groups of stem-changing verbs individually. There are 3 groups in total. The first group, and perhaps the largest, is the group that is often referred to as E to IE verbs. This is because the last vowel of the stem of each of these verbs is an E, and it will change to an IE in all forms but nosotros and vosotros. Take, for example, the verb empezar, which means to begin or start. Notice that all the forms but nosotros and vosotros have the stem change, which is underlined. Also, notice that despite the irregularity, the endings for empezar are typical, regular, normal ar endings. That is true with all stem-changing verbs. The stem vowel changes, but the endings are normal for their group, be they ar verbs, verbs, or ir verbs. In fact, many call stem-changing verbs shoe verbs or boot verbs because you can somewhat draw a shoe or boot around those forms that will have a stem change. This is a fairly large group of verbs, but a few of them include the following: cerrar, comenzar, entender, pensar, preferir, and querer. And there's actually two more, tener and venir. More on these two in part 3 of the series. The next group of stem-changing verbs are the O to UE verbs. This is a fairly large group of verbs, although not quite as big as the E to IE. Almorzar, to eat lunch, is a typical O to UE verb. Just like with empezar in the previous screen, the last stem vowel, this time the O, changes to a diphthong, this time a UE. And just as we saw before, the endings for almorzar are the same as for any ar verb. A few other O to UE verbs include contar, costar, dormir, encontrar, mostrar, poder, recordar, and volver. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a good place to start. There is also one more verb that frequently gets lumped into this group, as it has a stem change that involves a UE. However, jugar is a U to UE verb. It is the only one in the entire language of Spanish. And just like we saw with the E to IE verbs, you can see how all forms but nosotros and vosotros have a stem change. The last group of stem-changing verbs is also the smallest, the E to I group. Same story as before, but this time there is no diphthong, only an I that replaces the last vowel of the stem. One such verb is servir, meaning to serve. Just as we have seen in the other slides, the last vowel of the stem changes, and the endings are the same ones we would expect for any ir verb. And just as we have seen before, all forms but nosotros and vosotros show this stem change. While there are not many, there are a few other verbs in Spanish that are part of this group. Conseguir, decir, pedir, repetir, and seguir. Note that decir is part of this group, and yet we saw it in part 1 with the other go verbs. Well, we will return to decir in part 3 of this series. Okay, take a deep breath. That was a lot to remember. But as was mentioned before, the best way to remember all of this is to keep practicing. Make up random sentences in Spanish. Do drills. Talk with people and purposely use these verbs. The cliche is really true. Practice does make perfect. You can learn these verbs and use them well. Stay tuned for part 3 of this series where we focus on the fully irregular verbs. And we come back to our buddies tener, venir, and decir. Please like the video and leave any comments or questions that you have. Don't forget to subscribe to Lengua Franca's YouTube channel, which has more videos on Spanish grammar and much more. Oh, and please check out our Patreon page if you are at all interested in supporting us in our work. Hasta pronto. Adios.